The last few weeks before my 30th birthday were filled with anticipation and a strange sense of anxiety I couldn't explain. Marion, my wife of 5 years, insisted on throwing a huge party. She had always loved large-scale celebrations, while I preferred quieter gatherings with close friends. But seeing her enthusiasm, I couldn't say no. Our marriage seemed perfect to me, but lately something had subtly changed. Marion started a new hobby. She enrolled in tango lessons. At first I was happy for her, thinking it would help her relax after a busy day at work. But soon I noticed how she was transformed before each lesson. Carefully selects an outfit, does makeup, as if she was going on a date, not a dance class. When I suggested joining her for a class sometime, Marion's reaction was unexpectedly harsh. She said it was her personal space and time, and she wanted to have something of her own. I respected her desire but couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. The week before her birthday, we had a barbecue in the backyard. Among the guests was our neighbor Ross, who we often spent time with. He was a bachelor, and we often invited him over for dinner or to watch soccer. That evening, I noticed Marion and Ross talking animatedly away from the others. Their conversation seemed too intimate for mere neighbors, but I pushed the thought away. Marion was sociable by nature, and I trusted her completely. At one point, however, I saw Ross showing Marion some kind of dance move. She was laughing and trying to repeat after him, their bodies too close together. When I approached them, they both looked slightly embarrassed, but quickly turned the conversation to the upcoming party. The days leading up to the celebration flew by in a hectic pace. Marion was fully immersed in the organization, and I tried not to get in the way. She was making guest lists, selecting menus, ordering decorations. Her energy and attention to detail always delighted me. I tried to help, but more often than not I just got in the way, causing her mild irritation. On the eve of my birthday, I came home earlier than usual, hoping to spend the evening with Marion. But she wasn't home. I called her, and she said she was late for an extra tango lesson, supposedly preparing a surprise for me for tomorrow's party. Her voice sounded excited, and I felt the prick of anxiety again. At night, I couldn't sleep for a long time, thinking about the day ahead and the changes in our lives. Marion lay next to me but seemed so far away. I couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would change everything, but I had no idea how prophetic that feeling would turn out to be. The morning of my 30th birthday began with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting into the bedroom. Marion must have gotten up before me to prepare a surprise. Through the half-sleep, I heard her light footsteps and felt the gentle touch of her lips on my cheek. When I opened my eyes, I saw the breakfast tray in front of me and my wife's radiant face. Her eyes glowed with warmth and love, and for a moment, all my recent doubts dissolved in that gaze. We spent the morning together, eating a leisurely breakfast and discussing plans for the day. Marion seemed a little distracted, glancing at her watch and checking her phone every now and then. She attributed it to excitement for the party, and I didn't pay much attention to it, fully trusting her organizational skills. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I could feel the anticipation of the upcoming festivities taking over me. After breakfast, Marion rushed off to run errands related to the preparations, leaving me alone. I decided to do a little work to distract myself, but concentration was difficult. My thoughts kept returning to the coming evening, to the guests I had not seen for a long time, to the possible surprises that Marion might have prepared. Toward noon, the first deliveries began to arrive. Huge bouquets of flowers, boxes of balloons, decorations. I helped put everything in its place, following the detailed instructions Marion had left before she left. Every detail had been thought out, and once again I marveled at her attention to detail. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Marion returned, laden with packages. She looked a little tired, but there was a spark of excitement in her eyes. We continued the preparations together, arranging furniture, hanging garlands, inflating balloons. The work was accompanied by constant phone calls from Marion. She was solving the last organizational issues, clarifying details with the catering, checking the arrival of musicians. I couldn't help but notice that Marion was more nervous than usual. Several times I heard her whispering on the phone as she retreated to another room. Each time I approached, she quickly ended the conversation, bestowing me with a slightly strained smile. For a moment, I thought I heard Ross's name, but I pushed the thought away, chalking up my anxiety to pre-holiday excitement. By 6 p.m., our house had been transformed beyond recognition. The living room was ablaze with holiday lights, the tables were laden with gourmet snacks and drinks, and an impressive three-tiered cake stood in the center of the room. Marian looked stunning in a new dress that I had never seen before. It emphasized her figure perfectly, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. She was nervously fixing her hair, glancing at her watch to see if everything was ready for the guests. The guests started arriving around 7. My coworkers from work were the first to arrive, followed by old friends from college. The house quickly filled with a buzz of voices, laughter, and music. Marian was the life of the party as always, moving easily from one group of guests to another, keeping the conversation going and making sure everyone had drinks and appetizers. I watched her with pride and affection, thinking about how lucky I was to have a wife. I noticed that Ross had arrived a little later than the others. He looked a little nervous as he handed me a gift, a bottle of expensive whiskey. We exchanged a few jokes about the good old days, and I couldn't help but notice the way his eyes kept returning to Marian. I put it down to the dazzling sight of her in her new dress. Who could resist such charm? The evening was picking up. We played board games, shared funny stories from the past, laughed at jokes. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed. At one point, I noticed Marian and Ross talking animatedly in the corner of the room. Their conversation seemed too intimate for a normal conversation between neighbors, but before I could walk over and join them, they were interrupted by other guests wanting to congratulate me. About 9 o'clock in the evening, Marian announced that she had prepared a special gift for me. The music died down, and all eyes turned to the center of the room where Marian began to dance the tango. I was amazed at the grace of her movements, the passion that emanated from her every gesture. I had never seen her like this before, free, confident, seductive. The guests were delighted, and I could not take my eyes off my wife, feeling myself falling in love with her all over again. At that moment, I felt proud and grateful to fate that this amazing woman is my wife. After the dance, Marian came to me, flushed and a little out of breath. I hugged her, whispering words of gratitude and admiration. For a moment, I thought she tensed in my embrace, but that feeling quickly passed, replaced by her warm smile. She kissed me, and in that kiss, I felt something new, some hidden passion I hadn't noticed before. The party continued. The guests were having fun, dancing, socializing. I went from one group to another, accepting congratulations and gifts, participating in conversations and jokes. From time to time, I looked for Marian, and every time our eyes met, she gave me a smile that made my heart sink. I noticed that Marian disappeared from my sight a few times for short periods of time, but every time I looked for her, she reappeared, radiant and attentive to all the guests. Ross also disappeared at times, but I was too engrossed in socializing with my other friends to pay much attention to that. Perhaps if I had been more attentive, I would have noticed some signs, but at that moment, I was completely absorbed in the party atmosphere. The time was approaching midnight, but the party was still in full swing. No one was going to disperse, and the atmosphere was getting more and more lively. I felt a slight intoxication from the champagne and the general merriment. Marian continued to shine, charming everyone around with her energy and charisma. Looking at her, I thought about how lucky I was, and made plans for our future, not realizing what turn the events of the evening would soon take. At that moment, overwhelmed with feelings and impressions from the celebration, I could not even imagine that very soon my world would be turned upside down, and this birthday would be the beginning of the most difficult period in my life. The celebration continued, and time seemed to lose its meaning. Midnight had long passed, but none of the guests were in a hurry to leave. The atmosphere in the house became more and more lively and relaxed. The alcohol was flowing, the laughter was getting louder, and the conversations more frank. I felt a little dizzy from the champagne I had drunk and the emotions I was feeling. The party had exceeded my expectations, and I was immensely grateful to Marian for her efforts. However, despite the general merriment, somewhere in the back of my mind, a vague uneasiness continued to throb. Marian continued to be the soul of the company, flitting effortlessly between groups of guests. Her laughter rang in the air, infecting everyone around her with its energy. I couldn't help but notice the many men in the room casting admiring glances at her. It simultaneously filled me with pride and some vague discomfort. At one point, I noticed that Ross was back by Marian's side. They were whispering animatedly about something, standing in the corner of the room. Their proximity, and the way Marian leaned slightly toward him as she listened to his words, gave me a pang of jealousy. I decided to approach them, but I was intercepted by an old college friend wanting to discuss the good old days. The conversation with my friend dragged on, and when I looked again in the direction where Marian and Ross were standing, they were gone. I looked around, but couldn't find them anywhere. The feeling of unease increased, but I tried to convince myself that it was just a play of imagination, spurred on by alcohol and fatigue. Trying to distract myself, I joined a group of colleagues discussing the latest news in our industry. The conversation was interesting, but I couldn't concentrate. My gaze wandered back and forth across the room, looking for Marian. It must have been about 15 minutes before I saw Marian coming down the stairs from the second floor. She looked a little disheveled, but a smile shone on her face. A few minutes later, I saw Ross, who had also come down from upstairs, joining the conversation with the other guests as if nothing had happened. The coincidence made my heart race. I tried to think of some innocent explanation for their simultaneous absence, but the intrusive thoughts kept me on my toes. Perhaps Marian was just showing Ross around the house, or were they discussing some kind of surprise for me? I tried to push the suspicions away, but they kept coming back. The party, meanwhile, continued. Someone suggested karaoke, and soon the living room was filled with unsteady but enthusiastic voices. Marian, as always, was the center of attention. She sang a rousing song, getting everyone cheering and singing along. Her energy was infectious, and for a while I forgot about my doubts, completely immersed in the atmosphere of the celebration. However, my anxiety returned when I noticed Ross leaning over to tuck a loose strand behind Marian's ear during another guest's performance. She smiled and nodded, and then, apologizing to those around her, headed towards the kitchen. Ross followed her a moment later. I fought the urge to follow them. On the one hand, it seemed paranoid and undignified to me. On the other, I couldn't shake the obsessive feeling that something was wrong. Eventually, curiosity and anxiety took over, and I made my way to the kitchen, trying to look casual. As I approached the door, I heard muffled voices. Marian and Ross were arguing in whispers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone of their voices was tense. Then there was a pause, and I heard a sound like a kiss. My heart sank. I was about to storm into the kitchen when I heard footsteps behind me. It was Sarah, Marian's best friend. She looked a little tipsy and asked if I'd seen Marian. I silently pointed toward the kitchen, not trusting my voice. Sarah, not noticing my condition, pushed open the door and walked in. I was left standing in the hallway, trying to gather my thoughts. A few seconds later, Marian and Sarah came out of the kitchen, chatting animatedly. Ross appeared next, holding a tray of drinks. All three seemed not to notice me standing in the shadows. Back in the living room, I felt like I was in a dream. The merriment around me seemed unreal, contrasting with the storm of emotions inside me. I tried to act normal, to smile and keep the conversation going, but I felt it was getting worse. Marian didn't seem to notice the change in my mood. She continued to be the perfect hostess, taking care of the guests and maintaining the festive atmosphere. Several times she came up to me, gave me a hug, kissed me on the cheek, and asked if everything was okay. I nodded and smiled, but a feeling of alienation grew inside me. Time passed, but the guests didn't seem to have any intention of leaving. Someone suggested a dance, and soon the center of the living room was an impromptu dance floor. Marian, of course, was the center of attention. She danced with one guest or another, but I couldn't help but notice how often she found herself paired with Ross. Watching them dance, I could feel a mixture of jealousy, anger, and hurt growing inside me. Their movements were too synchronized, their gazes too intimate. It didn't seem like a dance between neighbors or just friends. Their movements felt like some hidden story, understood only by the two of them. I tried to convince myself that it was all a figment of my imagination, heightened by alcohol and fatigue. After all, it was my birthday, and Marion had organized this beautiful party for me. How could she betray me on a day like this? But the more I watched her and Ross, the stronger my certainty became that there was something between them. It was in the little things, in the way they exchanged glances across the room, in their casual touches, in the way Marion laughed at his jokes. I felt like just a little more, and I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to be alone to gather my thoughts. Apologizing to the guests I was talking to, I made my way up to the second floor, heading for our bedroom. As I passed the study, I heard muffled voices. The door was ajar, and I recognized Marion and Sarah's voices. They were whispering heatedly about something. I knew it was wrong to eavesdrop, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something in the tone of their voices had me pinned in place. Holding my breath, I listened to their conversation, unaware that the next few minutes would completely change my life and overturn all my ideas about our marriage to Marion. Leaning against the wall near the ajar door of the study, I froze, listening to the muffled voices of Marion and Sarah. The music and laughter of the guests came from downstairs, providing a bizarre backdrop for the conversation that was about to turn my life upside down. "Marion, are you out of your mind? How can you take such a risk on Bill's birthday?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with excitement. A deep sigh was heard, and Marion replied, "I know it's crazy, but I can't help myself. Ross, he brings out something in me that I've never experienced before." My heart skipped a beat. I felt the ground go from under my feet, but forced myself to listen further. "But what about Bill? He's your husband, for God's sake!" Sarah became indignant. "Bill." Marion said my name with some strange mixture of tenderness and disappointment. "He's a good man, really, but it's different with Ross. You don't realize what a terrific lover he is." Every word Marion said was like a stab to the heart. I wanted to walk away, to cover my ears, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something held me in place, forcing me to absorb each painful revelation. "How long have you had this?" Sarah asked after a pause. "A few months now," Marion admitted. "Remember when I signed up for tango lessons? It was just an excuse to go out with Ross." I remembered how excited I'd been for Marion when she'd started tango lessons, how proud I'd been of her performance tonight. Now those memories were colored by the bitterness of betrayal. "God, Marion. And the sex? Is it really that good?" Sarah's voice was tinged with unconcealed curiosity. Marion laughed softly. "It's just incredible. Every time is like the first time. He knows my body better than I know myself. With him I feel alive, desirable, passionate. You see, with Bill, sex has always been, well, pleasurable. But with Ross, it's fireworks." I felt nausea coming up to my throat. Memories of Marion and I's intimate moments, which I'd considered special, now seemed pale and empty. "What's going to happen next?" Sarah asked. "Are you going to tell Bill?" A long pause hung. I held my breath, waiting for Marion's answer. "I don't know," she finally uttered. "Part of me wants to be honest with him. But the other part, you see, Bill is so naive, so trusting. He'd never suspect cheating. Maybe I can keep both of them in my life." Those words hit me the hardest. Naive? Gullible? Is that really how she sees me? A man who could be easily deceived and used? "Marion, you're playing with fire," Sarah warned me. "Sooner or later it will all come out. And then you'll lose them both." "I know," Marion sighed. "But I'm not ready to give up either of them just yet. Bill is stability, reliability, a shared past. And Ross is passion, adventure, new experiences. I need both." I felt something inside me break. The woman I loved, the woman I dreamed of spending my life with, was coldly discussing how to use me and continue her affair. "Aren't you afraid Bill will find out?" Sarah asked. "You and Ross weren't very discreet today." Marion laughed again, and that laughter cut my ears. "Bill? No, he's too immersed in work and his business to notice anything. Even if Ross and I were kissing right in front of him, he'd find some innocent explanation for it." I couldn't take it anymore. Pushing myself away from the door, I headed for the bedroom on unsteady legs. Closing the door behind me, I sank down onto the bed, feeling the world around me crumble. Memories of the past few months flashed before my eyes, taking on new, terrifying meaning. Marian's late returns from tango lessons, her sudden passion for new clothes and makeup, the mysterious messages on her phone, all of it added up to a picture of betrayal that I had refused to see for so long. Downstairs, the party continued. The laughter and music came to me as if from another world. How could I go back there and pretend everything was okay? How could I look Ross in the eye knowing he was sleeping with my wife? And how could I stand next to Marian, knowing that every touch, every smile she gave me was a lie? I don't know how long I sat like that, immersed in my thoughts. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. "Bill? Are you in here?" It was Marian. Her voice, once the most native in the world, now sounded false and alien. "Yes," I echoed, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. "I'll be right down." "Is everything okay?" she asked. "The guests are asking about you." "Of course I am," I replied. "Just a little tired from all the noise. Give me a couple minutes." "Okay, sweetie. Don't take too long," she said, and withdrew. Honey. That address, which had filled me with warmth before, now sounded like mockery. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me from there looked lost and broken. How could I go back to the party and pretend like nothing had happened? But I knew I had to do it, at least until the party was over. I didn't want to make a scene in front of all our friends and coworkers. It would be humiliating not only for me, but for Marian as well. Despite her betrayal, a part of me still cared for her. Taking a deep breath, I stood up and headed for the door. It was time to go back to my own birthday party, knowing that every smile, every laugh, every touch from my wife would now reverberate with pain in my heart. As I walked down the stairs, I heard Marian's familiar laughter. She stood surrounded by guests, holding a glass of champagne in her hand. Her eyes were shining, her cheeks flushed. She looked incredibly beautiful and happy, and a complete stranger. Ross was nearby, chatting with one of my coworkers. When he saw me, he nodded and raised his glass in my direction. I felt everything inside clench with anger and disgust, but forced myself to nod back. "Here comes the birthday boy," someone exclaimed, and the guest's attention turned to me. Marian came over and put her arm around my waist. "Is everything okay?" she whispered. I nodded, trying not to flinch at her touch. "Just a little tired," I replied, marveling at my own composure. "Maybe it's time to cut the cake?" she suggested, and the guests animatedly agreed. The next half hour passed like a blur. I smiled, thanked them for their congratulations, blew out the candles on the cake. But inside me, a storm of emotions raged. Every time I saw Marian and Ross exchange glances or get close, I wanted to scream, to smash something, to grab Ross by the chest and demand an explanation. But I held back. Part of me still couldn't believe the reality of what was happening. Maybe this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Maybe I had misunderstood their conversation. But the more I watched Marian and Ross, the clearer it became that it was all the bitter truth. The guests began to leave toward morning. I mechanically said goodbye to them, thanked them for gifts and wishes. Marian was beside me, charming and attentive as ever. But now I could see the falseness in her smile, the insincerity in her words. Ross was one of the last to leave. Saying goodbye, he shook my hand firmly and said, "Great party, buddy. We should get together like this more often." I looked into his eyes, trying to see even a shadow of guilt or embarrassment. But there was only a friendly smile there. How could he stand so calmly in front of me, knowing he was sleeping with my wife? When the door closed behind the last guest, there was an oppressive silence in the house. Marian and I were left alone amidst the mess of the after-party. She turned to me with a tired smile. "Well, this is it," she said. "I hope you enjoyed the party." I stared at her, not knowing what to say. How had we come to this? When did our love turn into a lie? What was I supposed to do with that knowledge now? "Bill?" Marian stepped closer, looking at me worriedly. "You're acting kind of weird. Are you sure everything's okay?" I opened my mouth, ready to spill everything that had come to a boil. To tell her I knew about her cheating, to demand an explanation, to scream in pain and anger. But instead, I heard my own calm voice. "It's okay. I'm just tired. Let's go to bed and leave the cleaning for tomorrow. Marion nodded, smiling with relief. Sure, sweetie. Let's go. Walking up the stairs after her, I felt like an outsider in my own life. The night after discovering Marion's infidelity had been the longest of my life. Lying in bed next to the woman I thought was the love of my life, I felt infinitely lonely. Every breath she took, every movement in her sleep echoed in my heart. My thoughts were racing in my head, not giving me a moment's peace. I remembered every detail of the overheard conversation, every look and gesture that Marion and Ross had exchanged at the party. Now, knowing the truth, I saw everything in a completely different light. Their supposedly casual touches, their quiet conversations in the corner, their synchronized disappearances, it all added up to a mosaic of betrayal that I had refused to notice for so long. Several times during the night, I was on the verge of waking Marion and demanding an explanation. I wanted to scream, to accuse, to vent all the pain and anger that was tearing me up inside. But every time, something stopped me. Maybe a vestige of pride or fear of the inevitable consequences of this conversation. Toward dawn, I quietly got out of bed, careful not to disturb the sleeping Marion. She looked so peaceful, so familiar, and yet so completely foreign. How could the woman with whom we had shared life for the past 5 years be capable of such betrayal? Walking down to the living room, I found myself face to face with the after-party mess. Empty glasses, unfinished appetizers, scattered decorations, all reminders of a celebration that should have been a joyous occasion, but had turned into the beginning of a nightmare. Mechanically, I began to clean up, trying to keep my hands busy and distract myself from my agonizing thoughts. Each item I picked up brought up a new painful memory. There's the glass Marion drank from while dancing with Ross. And here was the napkin with her lipstick imprint. I wondered how many times those lips had kissed another man. The cleanup took hours, but I barely noticed the passage of time. The sun was already high when I finished. The house looked spotlessly clean, but that only emphasized the chaos in my soul. Stepping out into the yard, I took a deep breath of the fresh morning air. The world around me seemed unchanged, the same trees, the same sky, the same sounds of the waking city. But for me, everything had changed irrevocably. Sitting on a bench in the garden, I tried to decide what to do next. A confrontation with Marion seemed inevitable, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. Part of me still hoped that this was some terrible misunderstanding, that I had misunderstood or misinterpreted what I had heard. But the rational part of me kept telling me that I was just trying to fool myself. Around noon, I heard the back door of the house open. Marion, still in her housecoat, stepped out onto the terrace. Her hair was disheveled from sleep, her face imprinted with pillow marks. I'd once found it charming, but now all I could think about was how she looked dancing with Ross, how her eyes shone when she talked about him. "Bill?" she called out, her voice sounding hoarse after a long sleep. "Have you been here all morning? Why didn't you wake me up?" I didn't answer, not trusting my voice. Marion came down from the terrace and came closer, her face expressing a mixture of worry and confusion. "Is everything all right?" she asked, reaching out to touch my shoulder. "You look terrible. Been up all night?" I instinctively pulled away from her touch. The movement didn't escape Marion's notice, and her concern only seemed to intensify. "Bill, what's wrong?" A note of alarm appeared in her voice. "You're frightening me! Talk to me, please!" I raised my eyes and looked into her face. The woman standing in front of me was the same woman I'd loved all these years. The same eyes, the same lips, the same facial features. But now I saw her as someone else too, a stranger capable of lies and betrayal. "We need to talk, Marion," I finally said, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. Her eyes widened, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of fear in them. But perhaps it was only a play of my imagination. "Of course," she replied, trying to smile. "What do you want to talk about?" I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the conversation that would change our lives forever. At this point, I still didn't know how it would end, but I was sure of one thing. Nothing would ever be the same again. "About you and Ross," I said, as I watched the smile disappear from her face, replaced by an expression of shock and fear. The moment of truth had arrived, and there was nowhere to retreat. We were on the verge of a conversation that would either destroy our marriage for good or give it a chance to be salvaged. But regardless of the outcome, I knew I could no longer live a lie. It was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. The words that escaped my lips hung in the air like a heavy veil. Marian's face, contrary to my expectations, showed neither shock nor remorse. Instead, there was an expression of cold indifference, bordering on contempt. Her reaction stunned me even more than the fact of the affair. Marian straightened, crossing her arms over her chest. Her gaze became hard, almost defiant. She didn't try to deny or justify herself. Instead, she began to speak in a tone of blatant disdain. Every word she spoke was like a whip, soaked with the venom of indifference and accusation. She said she'd been looking forward to this conversation for a long time, wondering how long it had taken me to notice the obvious. Her voice was drenched in sarcasm as she spoke of my blindness and naivety. Marian didn't deny her connection to Ross. On the contrary, she spoke of it with a kind of perverse pleasure, describing how he understood her, how he made her feel like a woman. Every word she said was like a knife to my heart, but the worst was ahead. Marian went on the offensive, accusing me of driving her to infidelity. She spoke of years of sexual frustration, of my inability to understand her needs. Her voice grew louder, her words harsher. She accused me of being too immersed in my work, that I had stopped paying attention to her, that I couldn't satisfy her emotionally or physically, that Ross gave her what I could never give her: passion, understanding, real pleasure. I stood stunned by this flood of accusations and revelations. Every word she said was like a blow. I tried to object, to defend myself, but Marian wouldn't let me get a word in edgewise. She spewed years of accumulated frustration and resentment at me, not caring how it hurt me. The anger I'd been holding back all this time began to boil up inside of me. I could feel myself losing control of myself. In a fit of rage, I shouted an insult, calling Marian a whore. The word hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. For a moment, there was an oppressive silence. Marian grinned, her eyes flashing with a dangerous glint. She parried that I'd rather be a whore than live with a lowlife like me. Those words were the last straw. Without controlling myself, I took a step forward and slapped Marian across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the room. Marian recoiled, holding her cheek. Her eyes widened with shock and pain. For a moment, we both froze, shocked by what had happened. The realization of what I had just done hit me like a ton of bricks. Terror and shame overwhelmed me. Marian slowly lowered her hand, her cheek flushed red from the impact. In her eyes, I saw a mixture of pain, fear, and triumph, as if this act of violence on my part confirmed all her accusations, justified her betrayal. I tried to apologize, but the words stuck in my throat. Marian looked at me with cold contempt. She quietly but firmly told me to get out of her house. There was no fear or pleading in her voice, just icy indifference. Realizing that I had done something irreparable, I turned silently and headed for the exit. There was no point in packing. I just wanted to get as far away from here as possible. I could feel Marian's eyes on me as I left the house, but I didn't dare turn around. As I drove, I didn't know where I was going. I just wanted to get as far away from the house, from Marian, from everything that reminded me of what had happened. I drove without a specific destination, letting the road take me away from the pain, shame, and disappointment. A few hours later, I found myself in a small coastal town. I found a small motel overlooking the ocean and got a room. Fatigue came over me as soon as I crossed the threshold of the room. Collapsing onto the bed, I finally allowed myself to fully immerse myself in my emotions. The tears I'd been holding back all this time came in floods. I cried from the pain of betrayal, from anger at Marian and Ross, from shame at what I'd done. But most of all, the realization that our marriage was probably over, and over in the worst possible way. When the tears finally dried up, I felt devastated. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I tried to figure out how we had gotten to this point. How had our marriage become such an empty shell? Had I really been so blind that I hadn't noticed her dissatisfaction all these years? And how could I have raised my hand against her despite all the pain and anger? Thoughts of the future terrified me. I didn't know if our marriage had a future after all this. Would we ever be able to bridge this chasm of hurt, blame, and violence? And most importantly, did I want to? The ringing of the phone interrupted my musings. It was Marian. I hesitated but answered anyway. The conversation was short and tense. She wanted to know where I was and when I would be back. There was no hint of forgiveness or reconciliation in her voice. She spoke coldly and matter-of-factly, as if to a stranger. After the conversation, I felt even more devastated. I went out on the motel balcony and took a long look at the ocean. The sound of the waves calmed me down a bit, but the questions continued to swirl in my head. What would I do next? Should I try to save a marriage that was left with only bitterness and mutual recriminations? Would I ever be able to forgive Marian for cheating on me? And could she ever forgive me for raising my hand against her? But the most important question was whether I could forgive myself for ignoring Marian's unhappiness all these years, for letting my anger get the best of me and hitting the woman I swore to love and protect, for being unable to save our marriage. I knew I couldn't answer those questions right now. I needed time to think things through, to sort out my feelings and decide what I really wanted. I needed to figure out if Marian and I had a chance to start over, or if it would be better to let each other go and move on separately. Standing on the balcony and looking out at the vast ocean, I felt small and lost. The waves crashing against the shore reminded me of how my dreams and hopes were shattered. But at the same time, their constant motion gave a faint hope that life goes on, no matter what. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if I would find the strength to go home and face Marian. I didn't know if I would ever be able to trust her or any other woman again. But I did know one thing: there would be no more of the old life. No matter what happened next, that day had changed everything irrevocably. With these thoughts, I went back to my room feeling incredibly tired. Tomorrow would be a new day, and I would have to make hard decisions. But now I needed to rest, to gain strength for the upcoming trials. As I fell asleep, I could not get rid of the thought that perhaps the morning would be wiser than the evening, and with the first rays of the sun would come, if not a solution to all the problems, then at least an understanding of how to live on. The morning in the coastal motel greeted me with the merciless rays of the sun through the thin curtains. My head was buzzing from a sleepless night and the alcohol I'd drunk the night before. The events of the previous day came in waves, each one bringing new pain and shame. I struggled to get out of bed, feeling physically and emotionally broken. Walking over to the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the person looking back at me from there. The reddened eyes, the stubble, the gaunt face. It was as if it all belonged to someone else, not me. The cold shower cleared my thoughts a little, but it didn't wash away the heaviness from my soul. I dressed mechanically and left the room without a clear plan of action. I wandered along the embankment, watching the rare passers-by and listening to the cries of seagulls. The world around seemed unreal, like a set in some strange play. When I found a small cafe, I ordered a coffee and a sandwich, though I had no appetite at all. I tried to collect my thoughts, to put everything that had happened in its place. But my memories were jumbled, giving me fits of anger and waves of shame and regret. The image of Marian stood before my eyes, her cold, contemptuous gaze, her words full of venom and accusation. How could the woman I loved more than life turn into this alien, hostile creature? And how could I allow myself to raise a hand against her, no matter what she said or did? Guilt gnawed at me from the inside out. I thought back to our happy moments, the early years of marriage when we were so in love and full of hope for the future. Where and when had things gone wrong? Had I really been so blind that I hadn't noticed her unhappiness all these years? Then my thoughts turned to Ross, a man I considered a friend, who was a frequent visitor to our home. How long had their affair lasted? How many times had they laughed behind my back, thinking I was a naive fool? Anger began to boil up inside me again, but was quickly replaced by fatigue and desolation. The phone in my pocket felt incredibly heavy. I knew I should call Marian, try to talk, maybe apologize for what I had done. But what could I say? How could I fix something that seemed hopelessly broken? Leaving the cafe, I headed toward the beach. The sound of the waves and the cries of the seagulls created a strange sense of peace, contrasting with the storm of emotions inside me. I walked along the water's edge, letting the cool waves wash over my feet. Each step on the wet sand seemed to take a piece of heaviness from my soul. Suddenly, I began to remember moments from our life together that had seemed insignificant before. Her strained smile when I was late for work. The barely noticeable disappointment in her eyes when I'd canceled a weekend together because of an important project. Her gradually fading enthusiasm for our future plans. All these little details added up to a picture of a slowly crumbling marriage that I stubbornly refused to see. I thought about my work, how it gradually began to take up more and more space in my life. Could it be that I was using it as a refuge from the problems in my personal life? Was immersing myself in my work a way to avoid confrontation with the reality of our relationship? The sun was already slipping toward dusk when I finally decided to pull out my phone. A few missed calls from coworkers, a couple texts from friends wondering how the birthday was going. But nothing from Marian. Her silence was more eloquent than any words. Gathering my courage, I dialed her number. It seemed like an eternity. At last I heard her voice, cold and detached. Our conversation was short and tense. Marian informed me that she had gone to her sister's house and didn't want to see me. She said she would contact me through a lawyer. Those words sounded like a judgment on our marriage. After the conversation, I sat on the beach for a long time looking at the sunset. The beauty of nature seemed to mock the chaos of my life. I thought about the future, which now looked vague and frightening. Divorce, division of property, the inevitable questions from friends and coworkers. All of this awaited me ahead, but what scared me the most was the prospect of being alone. For the past 5 years, Marian had been the center of my universe, even if I didn't always show it. The thought of returning to an empty house, of life without her, caused almost physical pain. Back at the motel, I opened my laptop and began searching for information about divorce proceedings and the rights and responsibilities of spouses in a divorce. This activity, so mundane, seemed surreal in the context of what had happened. But it gave me the illusion of control over the situation, the feeling that I was doing something constructive. I spent the night awake, tossing and turning in the uncomfortable soaker bed. Thoughts of Marian and Ross kept me awake. I pictured them together, happy and carefree, and the images were almost physically painful. Then I thought about my parents, how they would react to the news of the divorce, about friends who would inevitably start choosing sides, about coworkers who would whisper behind my back. The morning found me exhausted and devastated. I realized I couldn't stay in this town any longer. I needed to return home, face reality. After gathering my few belongings, I checked out of the motel and got into my car. The drive home seemed endless. Every mile brought me closer to the reality I had been running from for the past few days. I didn't know what awaited me at home. Empty rooms or Marian packing her things. I didn't know if I was ready for either scenario. As I pulled up to the house, I felt my heart start to beat faster. Marian's car wasn't in the driveway, the first sign that the house was empty. Stepping inside, I was plunged into an oppressive silence. Everything looked the same as I'd left it a few days ago, but the atmosphere had changed. The house that used to be our sanctuary now seemed alien and cold. I slowly walked around the rooms, noting the absence of some of Marian's things. She had obviously stopped by to pick up the essentials. In the bedroom, on the bedside table, I found her wedding ring. That little gold band seemed to draw a line under our marriage. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I allowed myself to finally fully realize the reality of the situation. My marriage was over. The woman I loved had left me for someone else. I was left alone in a house full of memories of a happiness that now seemed so far away. The tears I had been holding back all these days finally broke through. I cried, giving vent to all the pain, anger, and frustration. I cried for lost love, for shattered dreams, for a future that would now be gone. But somewhere deep inside, there was a faint hope. Hope that one day this pain would subside and I could move on. That this wasn't the end, just a new beginning, no matter how difficult it might be. The days after I returned home blended into one endless stream of pain, regret, and trying to make sense of what had happened. The empty house, devoid of Marian's presence, felt foreign and cold. Every corner, every object reminded me of happy moments that were now only memories. I spent the first week in a kind of daze, mechanically performing routine activities. I went to work, where my colleagues carefully avoided talking about my personal life, and returned home, where I was met with oppressive silence. Nights were the most difficult. Insomnia was my constant companion. Thoughts of Marion and Ross kept me awake. I pictured them together, happy and carefree, and the images were almost physically painful. But gradually, through the shroud of pain and resentment, I began to realize my own role in the collapse of our marriage. I remembered the moments when Marion had tried to reach out to me, to tell me her feelings and needs. How I, immersed in my work and my own ambitions, had brushed off her attempts at intimacy as insignificant whims. I now realized that each such moment was a brick in the wall of alienation that had grown between us. 2 weeks after my return, I received official notice from Marion's attorney that divorce proceedings had begun. This document, dry and formal, was the final confirmation of the collapse of our relationship. I sat looking at those lines for a long time, trying to realize that 5 years of our life together would now be divided by lawyers and judges. Deciding I couldn't handle it alone, I sought the help of a therapist. The first sessions were painful. I relived all the stages of our breakup with Marion, analyzed my feelings and actions. Gradually, however, these conversations began to bring relief. I was learning to accept my emotions without judging myself for anger or sadness. One of the most difficult moments was having to tell my parents about the divorce. Their frustration in trying to find a way to make things right was hard for me. But that conversation was also a moment of truth. I realized that I could no longer live my life trying to conform to other people's expectations, even if they were those of the people closest to me. In parallel with the emotional work on myself, I immersed myself in the legal aspects of divorce. Meeting with attorneys, discussing property division. All of this was tedious and unpleasant, but necessary. I tried to approach the process as fairly as possible, not wanting to turn the divorce into a war. I saw Marion only once during this time, at the preliminary hearing in court. She looked distant and cold, avoided looking me in the eye. This meeting brought a new wave of pain, but also a strange sense of release. I realized that the woman sitting across from me in the courtroom was no longer the Marion I had loved all those years ago. Slowly, day by day, I began to build a new life. The first step was to update the interior of the house. I couldn't bring myself to sell it. There were too many good memories associated with the place. Instead, I decided to change it beyond recognition, to create a space that reflected my new self. I started spending more time on myself and my interests. I enrolled in photography courses, which I had long dreamed of taking, but had always put off until later. I began to meet more often with friends, many of whom provided me with invaluable support during this difficult period. Some connections, however, had to be broken. Those who sided with Marion or tried to manipulate the situation to their own advantage. Work, which used to be a way for me to escape from problems in my personal life, now took on a new meaning. I became more open to new ideas, more attentive to coworkers. This led to unexpected results. I was offered to lead a new promising project. One of the most difficult challenges was the need to forgive, not only Marion and Ross, but also myself. My therapist worked with me a lot on this aspect. I was learning to let go of resentment and anger, realizing that these emotions were poisoning me from the inside out for no good. The process of forgiveness was long and painful. There were days when old resentments would come back with renewed vigor, and I would feel like I was back to square one. But gradually I began to notice that these attacks became less frequent and weaker. I learned not to suppress negative emotions, but to live them and let them go naturally. An important milestone was the realization that I no longer defined myself through the prism of my relationship with Marion. I began to see myself as an individual in my own right, with my own goals, dreams, and values. It was frightening, and at the same time incredibly liberating. 6 months after the divorce proceedings began, the final court hearing took place. Walking out of the courthouse with divorce papers in hand, I experienced a strange feeling, a mixture of sadness and relief. An important stage of my life was over. but new horizons were opening up ahead. That evening, I took a long walk around the city, thinking about the past and the future. I remembered the happy moments I had spent with Marion, but now those memories didn't cause acute pain. I was grateful for the good things in our marriage and ready to move on. Gradually, I began to notice the beauty of the world around me, the bright colors of the sunset, the smiles of passers-by, the scent of blossoming trees. Life, which had recently seemed gray and joyless, regained its colors. I began to appreciate small things more: a good cup of coffee in the morning, warm summer rain, sincere laughter of a friend. The thought of a new relationship still scared me, but I no longer rejected the possibility completely. I realized that I needed time to heal completely, but I was open to the prospect of one day loving and being loved again.